Next, I'm going to introduce a very special person. Some of you who were here last year will remember this person, Bruce Aylward. Bruce is a physician. He has worked for WHO for almost 25 years. He was the key force in stopping polio in Africa. And about 2 weeks from now last year, he gave me a call. He said he was just about ready to leave the conference and go on vacation with his wife, something he really wanted to do. And he called me and he says, you know, Jack, based on the experience of my polio and successes, WHO has recruited me to lead the Ebola effort. And Bruce has worked literally around the clock. I know this because calls and emails are going around the clock to fight the fight against this amazing disease. And he's going to tell us a little bit about that disease and what he's doing, what he has done, and what he continues to do in his noble efforts there. Bruce? Welcome, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Over the last 12 months, we've been struggling with probably the greatest challenge we've ever faced in international public health, as we've struggled with the Ebola crisis that you've seen unfolding on your television screens and on screens like those around the world. This afternoon, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the extraordinary international response and national response to this crisis, a little bit about the central role that GIS has played in helping guide and steer this response over that 12 months. But the most important message I want to leave you with is that this crisis is not over. It may have disappeared from our television screens, but is very much still a part of life in these countries of West Africa. And the main reason I'm here today is to remind you of that, remind you of how much is still to be done, and how important GIS and the skills that many of you have will be to helping us get this finished. To begin the story, I wanted to introduce you to the virus that you've been hearing so much about over the last 12 months. This is the Ebola virus, and this is why you're hearing so much about it. This virus can kill 90% of the people that it infects. There's no vaccine, there is no medicine, and there is no cure. And we don't know a huge amount about this disease. And in fact, we've only known it for about 35 years now, since it first emerged from an animal reservoir, probably a wild bat population in Central Africa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo back in 1976. Over the subsequent 30 years, we did learn a fair bit about this virus, and as of last year, we thought we knew the virus pretty well, as it infected and caused outbreaks in more than a dozen or more than 24 different outbreaks in half a dozen countries clustered around Central Africa, as you see here on this slide, represented by these white dots. And during the course of that time, we came to think that we knew how to control Ebola, because although we didn't have a vaccine and we didn't have a drug that would work, we did know how to diagnose it. And we learned over the course of those outbreaks and those 30 years that by really engaging the communities that it struck and educating those communities about this terrifying disease, and then concentrating efforts on finding every single case, getting them into a treatment center where they might survive with supportive care, and then tracing every one of their contacts so that they could be rapidly isolated if they became sick. By doing those things, we could break the chains of transmission and eventually stop an outbreak. The other key piece of the response was ensuring safe burials, because this disease is one of the most unforgiving that we know. This disease, not only does it make it impossible for families to care for their sick without getting sick themselves, but also it does not let them bury their dead with the dignity and the rituals they would like, because that is when these bodies can be the most infectious and the most dangerous. So though we learned all these things, when this virus hit West Africa in 2014, it hit it with a fury and in a way that made us go right back to the beginning and question much of what we'd learned about controlling this disease, especially on the scale with which it struck in West Africa. In West Africa, this outbreak began much the way we saw in Central Africa. A little village in an area called Gekedu here in the eastern part of Guinea became infected when somebody came in contact probably with an infected bat. We're not exactly sure how this outbreak happened. But instead of remaining in that village and causing carnage really in that single place as it had in so many other occasions, or most of the occasions and previous outbreaks, the virus did something very different. In this part of West Africa, the virus took advantage of the fact that people had never seen it before. They didn't recognize the disease. They didn't understand the disease. And when they finally began to, they began to generate rumors about what it really was. And the virus took advantage of this, as you can see here. And it spread relentlessly across West Africa, across Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And by the end, over 26,000 people had been infected with this virus, and it left over 11,000 people dead. And stopping the outbreak would require an extraordinary national and international response. But before we even got to that, scenes like this were becoming more and more common across the rural parts of these three countries. Terrifying scenes like this where specially clad teams would have to come and carry away the dead so that people could not even pay their final respects to their loved ones. And as terrifying as scenes like this, as terrifying as the virus itself, were often the people that came to help because they were covered in garb like this, which we've become so familiar with now, again on our television screens and in our newspapers. But imagine if you're living in a very rural village, one of the poorest areas of Africa, and people like this are coming to take care of your sick, to take away your dead. It's a terrifying, terrifying thing for anybody, and especially in these environments. These environments further complicated the response. As you can see from these pictures, this part of West Africa is one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited in my life. Beautiful mountains, beautiful waterways, but every one of these things make it that much more difficult to mount the response that we needed to. It isolates the villages and allows rumors to run rife about what this disease was all about and what the intent of the foreigners who were coming to help were really all about. And as a result, the disease, again, as I mentioned, took advantage. What you see here is what we call the epidemic curve of the first months of this outbreak. And you can see, but by August, something very different was happening than had happened in any of the other Ebola outbreaks that we'd come to know and on which we'd based so much of our experience. By August, all of a sudden, the virus had started to increase like this, what we call exponential growth. That had never been seen before with this virus, suggesting that it was beginning to spread at a rate that might become uncontrollable. Very shortly after that, there was international panic when suddenly this virus was found in Nigeria as a result of the international travel of somebody affected by the disease from Liberia. Very shortly thereafter, a case was found in this country, and then in other countries in Europe and other countries of Africa. Nearly 10 countries in total suffered an importation or experienced this disease. And at that point, the Centers for Disease Control here in this country, working with what was imperfect data, but the best that they had, made projections, the horrifying projection that we had only seen the beginning of this crisis, and that we could see over 1 million people dead from Ebola, something unimaginable only years earlier, but within 6 months of when they published these findings. Ladies and gentlemen, that combination of events to the declaration on the 8th of August of an international emergency and crisis, requiring an extraordinary international response to help the governments of these countries, the people of these countries, to get Ebola back under control. But what happened next was even more extraordinary. Instead of an incredible international effort to help these countries to isolate the virus, what happened was international panic and often hysteria, fueled by a lack of understanding of what Ebola was and how it spread. And as a result, Airlines stopped flying into these countries. The economies ground to a halt. The schools started to close, and the economies, as I mentioned, began increasingly rapidly to collapse. The countries where we were hoping to isolate the virus were instead being isolated themselves. By this point, I was involved in the crisis. I had now, at this point, hundreds of people on the ground. Not only could we not move them between the countries, we could not move them in and out of the countries and refresh our teams as we needed to. That's how dire the situation had become by September of 2014. And that month, ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, took what is probably one of the bravest and boldest decisions ever by a UN Secretary General when he went to the UN Security Council on the 18th of September, and he, declaring this a crisis, called on the Council to launch the first ever United Nations mission for something other than peacekeeping. And what was launched that day and subsequently the next day by the UN General Assembly was the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response. And the Secretary General's intent, recognizing the status of these countries and the trouble that they were in, and potentially the entire region and even the world, he put at the disposal of the response the entire resources of the United Nations systems, our air assets, our land assets, our crisis management teams, information teams, GIS expertise, and further, to ensure that the superb NGOs like the Médecins Sans Frontières, the MSFs, the Red Cross experts, and the others who were already working on the ground there alongside or with us would also have the support needed to help these governments to reach every single village, every corner of these countries, and try and get this crisis stopped. To try and rally that huge international response, the vast majority of whom had never seen Ebola, didn't understand the response, didn't understand the strategies, to try and pull that all together. On the 20th of September, or 23rd of September, if I remember correctly now, on the 13th floor conference room at the United Nations in New York, we put a big goal up on a whiteboard there called 70-70-60. And what this was really, in retrospect, an incredibly audacious target to try and reverse that curve, that exponential curve that you saw that the CDC had projected. Our goal was to reverse that as rapidly as possible. And using some sophisticated mathematics and some modeling, we calculated that by safely burying 70% of the people who died of this disease and isolating the cases, 70% of those cases, people affected within days of getting infected, and if we could do all of that within 60 days, we would be able to bend the curve, so to speak, and reverse the course of this relentless and terrifying epidemic. This was a huge and ambitious target more than 12 months ago, or just under 12 months ago, when it was set. But the international community and the countries set out to achieve this with an incredible vigor. And over the subsequent couple of months, subsequent 60 days only, a huge number of Ebola treatment centers of unprecedented size, like you can see in this picture, were built. Never before in history had we ever had to create something on this scale to try and control a disease like this. Hundreds of burial teams were also trained to be able to go to every corner of these countries and ensure anyone who died of Ebola could have a safe and dignified burial in this time of crisis. We relied heavily on GIS tools at that time, both to plot where we would put these resources to ensure that it was tracking the evolving epidemiology of the disease so that we could try and get one step ahead of it. We also used some more sophisticated GIS tools like you see on the right-hand side of this graphic here. We created a drive time analysis to try and ensure that for any part of these countries, they could be within a 1 hour to 2 hour drive of a treatment center, because we were learning there was such huge suspicion of this disease that if people could not get to a treatment center very, very quickly, they would prefer to stay at home and die with their family and their loved ones rather than seek treatment. It was that terrifying and hopeless a situation back in October of 2014. All of these tools, all of these capacities were absolutely essential, but nothing was more essential than the work, and a lot of this spearheaded by UNICEF, to engage the populations, ensure that they understood the disease, that they themselves were part of the work to find every case, find every contact, and ensure that they were properly treated and properly managed. And as a result of this, ladies and gentlemen, this curve here, which had continued in the subsequent month to trend upward like this terrifying arc toward that 1 million cases that the CDC had projected, as a result of UNMIR and of the effort, the tremendous international effort that was launched in September, we saw what I believe is one of the most extraordinary things I've seen in 30 years of working in international health and crisis management. And this was the reversal of this trend. This was an extraordinary achievement. I just wish that the hundreds and thousands of people who made that happen were here to hear your applause, ladies and gentlemen, because there's a lot of very, very brave, very, very courageous people who deserve to hear that. I will see a lot of them toward the end of this week, though, and I'll pass it on. But this is the impact, ladies and gentlemen. And with this, obviously, there was a tremendous resurgence of hope that this thing could be gotten back under control. But in reality, this is when the going got really, really tough, because it was at this point that we had to shift to the next part of the strategy and begin the painstaking work of finding every single case, trying to find every single contact related to a case at a time when people were still very suspicious of the response, still hiding cases, hiding contacts, even hiding the corpses so that they could bury and care their dead and care for their sick at home themselves. So teams, whether from MSF, the World Health Organization, or one of our many, many partners, began the painstaking work of going village by village, slum by slum, house by house, to search for those cases, find the cases, explain the response to the communities, and begin the work of trying to stop the many, many transmission chains that were still ongoing in these countries. And what you see here is a map which shows you that we ended up deploying people, well over 1,000 from WHO itself, but probably 10,000 from all of our partner agencies and the governments, right across every single district and every single prefecture of these countries. Over the subsequent months, we would have to move these people, obviously, quickly and efficiently to ensure that we were keeping them in front of the virus, finding the virus as the epidemiology evolved over the subsequent days and weeks. Much of the work of these people were to find not just the cases, but even the villages. Because while we talk about the power of GIS, of course, that power isn't much if we don't know where the villages are, where the people are, and if they aren't on a map. And we've got to get them on the maps if we were to be successful. You see here one of the hard-struck villages in a part of Sierra Leone, one corner of Sierra Leone. This was taken about 3 weeks ago when I was in the region. And already the rains had begun there. As you can see, the roads were getting almost impassable, but still the virus was persisting in some of these very difficult and far-flung areas. And I would remind you how important it was to get to zero, because in Guinea, where this had all begun, the virus twice had been thought to have been gotten to zero before it took off again and exploded, because every single case, every infected village had not been found. So we deployed thousands of people now across the region in very tough circumstances, very tough areas, to find these villages, to get these villages finally on a map where we could then concentrate so much more of our resources to ensure the people were getting the care that they needed and that they would engage themselves in the response so that this thing could be brought to an end. And it wasn't just the World Health Organization that was out there, or MSF, or UNICEF, and those other agencies. There were also huge work being done by supporting agencies like the World Food Program, who was ensuring that we got the food necessary out to these communities so that they could be taken care of as they remained at home and tried not to infect others while we determined whether or not they themselves were sick with the disease. This was a huge effort, huge logistical effort, much of it guided by the kind of work that you do, by the kind of tools that have been developed through the GIS community. And ladies and gentlemen, what happened subsequently as we came out of this period or phase, the 70-70-60 phase, and moved into the case finding and contact tracing phase, was this further drop in cases, but this long tail that you see here. Huge progress was made, but this virus, and that last bar on that chart there shows you where we are today, still remains entrenched in corners of these countries. And again, that's the reason I'm here today, to remind us that we have not finished the job, and we cannot finish it without the continued attention, the continued support, and the continued help of people with skills like the skills that all of you have. Because the closer we get to zero, the more important GIS becomes to guide the response, to guide the use of our resources, to track the transmission chains, and get the job finished. So how do we get from here to zero? Well, the big challenge now is to find not only every single case, but every single person who has been in contact with a case so that they can be rapidly isolated if they get sick, and the final chains of transmission can be stopped before this thing starts to take off again. This is Ibrahim. Ibrahim is a 6-year-old boy that I met about 6 weeks ago when I was in one corner of Sierra Leone in a place called Kafur-Bulam. Ibrahim was, when I first met him about 6 weeks ago, he was a contact. His grandmother, if I remember correctly, had been sick with Ebola and was in a treatment center at that time. This mischievous little boy was a contact at that time. The second time I went to his house, about 3 weeks later, he was a case. Ibrahim had been taken to one of the treatment centers himself and was sick with the disease. When I was last in the region and went to his house, Ibrahim was dead. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reality of this disease. It is a terrifying, heartbreaking, ferocious disease that kills the most vulnerable and, again, does it relentlessly. If we are to finish the job now, it is absolutely essential that we get an even more refined understanding of this disease, and we can build out what we call transmission chains like this, so we can understand who had the disease, who was in contact with who, just like Ibrahim and who he was in contact with, who was in contact with him, so that we can begin, again, trying to cut down and stop these last final chains of transmission. One of the last things I'd like to do before we wrap up is show you one of these new tools that we've just developed to be able to guide this final chain or this final aspect of the program. What you see here on the far right-hand side of your screen is the entire Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone for the last 3 weeks. There are 4 major transmission chains that you can see here highlighted. Every one of these dots represents an individual, and you can see them also on the map. And you can see from those individuals when they became infected, where they were infected, and what part of what transmission chain they are. With this, we then begin targeting into the infected areas to know exactly where the disease is, where it's spreading, and where the contacts of these people are. If I click right here, we can zoom in on one of the most important transmission chains we've been tackling in a place called Tonkalimba. And here you can see, again, the index case right here, who that person was and where the person was, and then where the most recent cases are. And with that, we can begin to guide, once again, the entire response to find every contact of those individuals, get to them as rapidly as possible, get them isolated so that we can stop these final chains of transmission. Ladies and gentlemen, as you've seen, it's been a very, very long and difficult and challenging, heartbreaking 12 months of this extraordinary response to stop Ebola in West Africa. We are not at zero yet, and the road in front of us is very, very challenging still. We still face community distrust as a result of years of lack of services in these areas. We are now in the rainy season, and I can assure you the rains there are even more challenging than what you faced here in San Diego yesterday. There are huge financing gaps still in front of us, and our information, though a huge way forward from where we were 12 months ago, is still imperfect. We have much, much better information, though, and I would like to recognize and thank so many of those in the GIS community who have been part of helping us build the kind of information you've seen presented through you here today. Almost all of this can be accessed and seen on our web portal, which I've just put up here for you to be able to access if you want to after the presentation. But still, our information isn't where it needs to be. We are still incredibly short of the expertise that we need in GIS to be able to get the job done. In each one of these countries, we may have one mapper or at most two, and often they're these GIS experts only for a couple of weeks. And if people were to ask me what's one of the most important things you would want, I would want a dozen excellent GIS experts who could be out there in the field with us, helping to ensure the information that we're generating in real time is put into the kind of transmission chains, put into the kind of tools you've just seen to help guide this final response. And ladies and gentlemen, with this last slide, I would just like to remind you of how important it is that we finish the job of stopping Ebola in West Africa. The future of these children, like the future of their countries, is right now in doubt. These countries are still affected by Ebola, although they're no longer on the front pages of the newspapers and on your television screens every night. The international airlines are still not flying there. Their economies are still ground to a halt, and the futures of children like this are still at risk. Ladies and gentlemen, it is so important that we get this job finished. I wanted to share this story with you, to thank you for the contributions that we've had from the GIS community, but most importantly, to thank you in advance for staying with us, staying with the people of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, and especially their children, and making sure we finish the job and we end Ebola very, very soon. Thank you.